I spent 11 years working as a border patrol agent in the remote stretches between Arizona and New Mexico, and in that time, I saw things that never made it into official reports. What I'm about to tell you happened in November 2019, during a routine overnight surveillance shift in an area so isolated that the nearest town was 40 miles away. I've kept quiet about it because I value my career and my reputation, but I'm retiring next month, and I need someone to know what's out there in those desert borderlands, watching us the same way we watch the border. The sector I patrolled covered roughly 300 square miles of high desert terrain, a landscape of scrub brush, rocky outcroppings, and dry arroyos that only filled with water during the brief monsoon season. It was beautiful in a harsh way, the kind of place that could kill you if you weren't careful, but it was also predictable. I knew every game trail, every water source, every cluster of boulders large enough to provide concealment. I'd tracked smugglers through that country for over a decade, learned to read signs that most people would miss, and developed instincts about when something was wrong. Those instincts kept me alive more than once. November in the high desert meant cold nights, temperatures dropping into the low 30s after sunset, and clear skies that made thermal imaging remarkably effective. I was stationed at Observation Post 7, an elevated position on a mesa that gave me line of sight across 15 miles of terrain. The post itself was nothing fancy, just a camouflaged blind with communication equipment and thermal optics mounted on a stable platform. My shift ran from 8 in the evening until 4 in the morning, 8 hours of watching the desert through a screen that showed heat signatures as bright shapes against the cool darkness. I'd been on duty for about 3 hours when I first noticed the signatures. It was just after 11, and I was scanning the eastern approach, an area of relatively flat terrain broken by scattered mesquite and creosote bush. The thermal display showed the usual pattern of small heat sources, rodents and rabbits moving through the brush, maybe a coyote in the distance. Then, I caught movement that didn't fit the normal pattern. 3 large heat signatures, moving in a coordinated line about 2 miles out, spaced roughly 50 yards apart. My first thought was a smuggling group, either drug mules or human traffickers moving through the sector, but the movement pattern was wrong. Smugglers move in tight groups, staying close together for mutual support and communication. These signatures were maintaining precise spacing while moving at a steady pace, more like a military patrol than a smuggling operation. I adjusted the thermal optics for maximum clarity and watched them progress across the landscape. The signatures were large, much larger than human, with heat distribution that suggested quadruped animals rather than people. I thought maybe wild horses or a small group of elk that had wandered down from the mountains, but the coordination bothered me. Wild animals don't maintain formation like that. They cluster and separate randomly, following individual impulses rather than group discipline. These 3 signatures moved with purpose, covering ground efficiently and maintaining their spacing with precision that seemed deliberate. I radioed dispatch to report the anomaly, keeping my voice neutral and professional. The dispatcher asked if I could identify the signatures more specifically, and I told her they appeared to be large animals, species unknown, moving in coordinated formation. She logged the report and told me to continue observation. Standard protocol for anything unusual. Document it and watch until it either crossed the border or moved out of sensor range. The signatures continued their progress, moving northwest at what I estimated was about 8 miles per hour, faster than humans could maintain over rough terrain, but slower than running. They stayed in formation for the next 20 minutes, covering almost 3 miles while I tracked them with the thermal optics. Then, they did something that made my stomach tighten with the first real unease I'd felt. They stopped, all 3 at exactly the same moment, and turned to face directly toward my observation post. I was 7 miles away, positioned in concealment that had been carefully designed to avoid visual detection. There was no way they could see me, no line of sight, no movement, nothing that should have drawn attention. But all 3 signatures oriented themselves toward my position with precision that couldn't be coincidental. They stood motionless for perhaps 2 minutes while I watched them through the thermal display, my hand moving instinctively to the rifle beside me, even though they were far beyond effective range. Then they moved again, but this time the formation changed. Two signatures remained stationary while the third began circling, moving in a wide arc that kept the same distance from my position. It was reconnaissance behavior, the kind of tactical movement I'd seen in military exercises, but never from animals. I increased the magnification on the thermal optics, trying to make out more detail, and what I saw made me question everything I thought I knew about the wildlife in that sector. The circling signature was moving on two legs. The thermal image showed clear bipedal locomotion, a gait that resembled human walking, but with proportions that were distinctly wrong. The torso was too long, the shoulders too broad, the head positioned at an angle that suggested a muzzle or snout rather than a human face. It moved with fluid grace, covering ground quickly despite the rough terrain, and it maintained perfect awareness of the other two signatures even while circling. I grabbed my handheld radio and called dispatch again, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline starting to pump through my system. I reported 3 large, unidentified bipedal signatures exhibiting coordinated tactical movement approximately 7 miles from my position. The dispatcher asked me to repeat, her tone suggesting she thought I'd misspoken. I repeated the report word for word, adding that the signatures were too large to be human and were moving in patterns that suggested intelligence and training. There was a long pause before she responded. She told me to maintain observation and that she was notifying the shift supervisor. I acknowledged and went back to watching the thermal display. The circling signature had completed about half of its arc around my position when it stopped again. It stood motionless, facing directly toward me, and I had the distinct and deeply unsettling impression that it was looking at me despite the distance and darkness. The other two signatures began moving again, this time closing the distance toward my position. They moved deliberately, using the terrain for concealment in ways that seemed too calculated for animals. They would advance 50 or 60 yards, pause behind cover, then advance again. It was bounding overwatch, an infantry tactic where elements of a unit advance while others provide security. I'd seen it executed by trained soldiers. I'd never seen it from anything else. My supervisor came on the radio, his voice tight with the kind of controlled tension that told me he was taking this seriously. He asked for a detailed description of what I was observing. I walked him through it, the coordinated movement, the bipedal locomotion, the tactical behavior that suggested training or instinct far beyond normal animal capability. He was quiet for a moment, then asked if I could get video documentation. I told him the thermal recorder was already running, capturing everything. The signatures continued their approach, moving with patience that was somehow more frightening than aggressive charging would have been. They were taking their time, using the landscape, staying in formation. I estimated they would reach my position in about 40 minutes at their current pace. My supervisor told me to prepare for evacuation, that he was sending a vehicle to extract me from the observation post. I acknowledged, but part of me knew that 40 minutes might not be enough time. I began packing my equipment, working quickly but methodically, maintaining visual contact with the thermal display between actions. The signatures were now about 4 miles out, close enough that I could make out more detail on the thermal image. They were massive, easily 7 feet tall when standing upright, with body mass that suggested several hundred pounds. The heat distribution showed areas of high temperature around the head and chest, consistent with high metabolic activity, possibly from sustained exertion or elevated heart rate. At 3 miles distance, they stopped again. All 3 signatures went motionless simultaneously, and I watched through the thermal optics as they appeared to communicate, the heat patterns shifting in ways that suggested movement of heads and possibly vocalizations I couldn't hear from this distance. Then they did something that confirmed what I'd been trying not to believe. They split up, 2 moving to flank my position from the north and south, while the third continued the direct approach from the east. This was not animal behavior. This was tactical assault preparation, a coordinated attack plan that required communication, planning, and understanding of terrain and target. I grabbed my rifle, chambered around, and reported the new movement pattern to my supervisor. His response was immediate and tense. The extraction vehicle was 20 minutes out, and I needed to hold position until it arrived. If the signatures reached my observation post before extraction, I was authorized to use whatever force necessary to defend myself. The direct approach signature continued forward, moving faster now, covering ground with long strides that the thermal image showed as smooth and purposeful. The two flanking signatures had disappeared into dead ground, areas where the terrain blocked my thermal line of sight, but I knew they were still out there, still moving, still coordinating with the one I could see. I positioned myself at the back of the observation post, rifle ready, watching the thermal display and listening for any sound that might indicate their proximity. At 1 mile distance, I heard it for the first time, a vocalization that came from the darkness to my east, low and resonant, something between a wolf's howl and a sound I couldn't identify, something that had tones and patterns that seemed almost structured, almost like language. It was answered from the north, then from the south, 3 voices calling to each other across the desert night. The sound made my skin crawl, made every instinct I had scream that I was in the presence of apex predators and I was being hunted. The extraction vehicle's headlights appeared in the distance, coming fast along the service road that led to my observation post. I could hear the engine now, the sound carrying clearly in the cold desert air. The thermal display showed the direct approach signature had stopped about half a mile out, standing motionless as if considering its options. The 2 flanking signatures remained out of my line of sight, somewhere in the dead ground to the north and south, but I knew they were close. I could feel their presence the way you feel a storm building on the horizon. My supervisor's voice came over the radio, telling me the vehicle was 3 minutes out and I should prepare for immediate extraction. I acknowledged and began moving my essential equipment toward the access trail that led down from the mesa. The thermal recorder stayed running, still capturing the signature that stood watching from half a mile away. I didn't want to turn my back on it, didn't want to lose visual contact, but I needed to get to the extraction point. That's when I saw the second signature emerge from the dead ground to the north. It appeared on the thermal display about 200 yards from my position, moving upslope toward the observation post with purposeful strides. I could see it clearly now, bipedal movement that was neither human nor any animal I'd encountered in 11 years of desert patrol. The proportions were wrong in ways that my brain struggled to process. The legs were digitigrade, meaning it walked on its toes like a canine, but the upper body was structured for upright posture with shoulders and arms that suggested manipulation capability beyond simple paws. I raised my rifle, acquiring the thermal signature through my night vision scope. The magnification brought it into clear focus, and what I saw made me understand why witnesses to these things struggled to find words. It had the head of a large canine, maybe a wolf, but scaled up beyond any wolf I'd ever seen, with a muzzle that was elongated and powerful. The body was heavily muscled, covered in what appeared to be thick fur that showed as darker areas on the thermal image where it insulated against heat loss. But it moved with a fluidity and intelligence that was distinctly unnatural, purposeful in ways that transcended animal instinct. The creature stopped advancing when it was about 150 yards out. It stood upright, and even through the thermal scope, I could see its head turn, scanning the observation post, the terrain, possibly looking for the extraction vehicle whose engine noise was now clearly audible. Then it did something that convinced me these things possessed intelligence far beyond what I'd been willing to consider. It dropped to all fours and moved laterally, repositioning itself to where it would have a clear line of sight to the access trail I needed to descend. It was cutting off my escape route, not charging blindly or attacking out of animal aggression, but making a calculated tactical decision to block my exit. I reported this to my supervisor, my voice finally losing the professional neutrality I'd maintained throughout the encounter. He told me the vehicle was 1 minute out, and I needed to move now, that they would provide covering support if necessary. I started down the trail, moving as quickly as I could while maintaining some level of tactical awareness. Behind me, the thermal display was still recording, still showing the signature that had blocked the northern approach. I could hear something moving in the brush to my south, heavy footfalls that were trying and failing to be silent. The third signature, the one from the flanking movement, was closing in from that direction. The extraction vehicle came around the final bend, high beams cutting through the darkness, and I saw my partner, Agent Martinez, behind the wheel, with another agent I didn't recognize in the passenger seat. They pulled up at the base of the trail, and Martinez was out immediately, rifle up, scanning the darkness while I descended the last 20 yards. The other agent had what looked like a spotlight, powerful enough to illuminate the entire area around the observation post. I reached the vehicle and threw my equipment in the back, then turned to provide security while Martinez got back behind the wheel. That's when the spotlight caught it. The beam swept across the northern slope and illuminated the creature for perhaps 3 seconds of clear visual confirmation. It was standing upright again, approximately 100 yards from our position, caught in full detail by the artificial light. 7 feet tall at minimum, maybe more, covered in dark fur that looked almost black in the spotlight's glare. The head was unmistakably canine, but proportioned for a much larger skull, with ears that stood erect and eyes that reflected the light back at us with an amber glow that seemed to contain recognition and calculation. The arms were long, ending in what I could clearly see were hands rather than paws, fingers tipped with claws that caught the light. It stood there in the spotlight, making no attempt to flee or hide, just watching us with an intensity that communicated threat more effectively than any aggressive display could have. Martinez shouted for us to get in the vehicle. The other agent kept the spotlight on the creature while I jumped into the back seat, and then we were moving, accelerating away from the observation post with enough speed to make the vehicle fishtail on the loose gravel. I looked back through the rear window and saw the creature still standing there, illuminated by our receding lights, tracking our movement with its eyes. We drove for about 5 miles before Martinez slowed to a more sustainable pace. Nobody spoke during those first few minutes. The other agent, whose name I learned was Carson, finally broke the silence by asking what the hell that thing was. I told him I didn't know, that in 11 years of Border Patrol I'd never seen anything like it. Martinez just kept driving, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the steering wheel with enough force to make his knuckles white. Back at the sector station, we were met by the shift supervisor and 2 individuals I'd never seen before. They identified themselves as wildlife management specialists, though they wore no agency identification and arrived in an unmarked vehicle. They asked to see the thermal footage immediately, and I handed over the recorder without argument. They watched the entire recording in silence, their faces showing no reaction, no surprise, no confusion. When it finished, one of them asked if anyone else had copies of the footage. I told them the system automatically backed up to sector servers. They made a phone call, had a brief conversation I couldn't hear, then told us the footage had been classified as sensitive surveillance data and would be handled through proper channels. We were instructed to file standard patrol reports noting observation of unidentified large animals exhibiting unusual behavior, possible wolf or large canine species, recommend further wildlife survey of the area. No mention of bipedal movement, no mention of coordinated tactical behavior, no mention of anything that would raise questions or invite scrutiny. The wildlife management specialists left with the thermal recorder, and we never saw them again. The footage never appeared in sector files. When I checked the server backups 2 days later, the files from that night had been removed. Carson and Martinez both followed the instructions, filed their reports exactly as directed, and never spoke about it again. I did the same, understanding that some things fall outside the official channels, that some observations don't fit the categories we're supposed to work within. But I made copies of my field notes, detailed documentation of everything I observed through the thermal optics, descriptions that I've kept in a safe deposit box for the past 5 years. I've thought about that night constantly since it happened. I've researched reports from other border agents, talked quietly with people who patrol remote areas, and found more accounts than I expected. Stories of coordinated pack movements observed on thermal imaging, reports of bipedal signatures that don't match any known animal, encounters that get classified as misidentification or equipment malfunction, filed away and forgotten. The desert borderlands are vast, hundreds of miles of remote territory where human presence is minimal and surveillance is focused on human threats rather than wildlife. If something intelligent wanted to move through that landscape undetected, it would have ideal conditions. The terrain provides natural concealment, the distances are enormous, and the official focus is elsewhere. What I saw that night was not random wildlife. It was coordinated, intelligent, and demonstrating tactical awareness that suggested either training or instinct refined through long practice. I've tried to rationalize it, to find conventional explanations for what the thermal imaging showed. Large canines that learned to walk upright temporarily. maybe some kind of mutation or evolutionary adaptation. Pack behavior that mimicked military tactics through coincidence rather than actual planning. Equipment malfunction that created false images matching my expectations. None of these explanations satisfy the evidence. What I observed was real, recorded by reliable equipment, witnessed by 3 trained agents, and significant enough that it was immediately classified and removed from official records. The question that keeps me awake is what they were doing. They weren't just passing through the sector. They approached my observation post deliberately, using tactics that suggested they understood what it was and possibly why I was there. They coordinated their movement to cut off my escape routes. They showed no fear of the extraction vehicle or the lights or the presence of multiple armed agents. That level of calculation and confidence suggests something that has been observing us as carefully as we observe the border. I'll be retiring in 3 weeks, leaving the Border Patrol after 11 years of service. I've put in my time, done my job, and earned my pension. But I'm leaving with knowledge that I was never supposed to have, awareness of something that operates in the spaces between official recognition and public understanding. The desert borderlands host more than smugglers and migrants. There are things out there that have learned to use the vast empty spaces for their own purposes, things that watch us from the darkness and move with intelligence that we're not prepared to acknowledge. If you spend time in remote desert areas, particularly along the southern border regions, understand that you're not alone out there. The thermal signatures I tracked that night represented something that exists in reality, not folklore. They hunt, they coordinate, they plan, and they show no fear of human presence. I don't know what they are or where they came from or how many of them exist in those remote territories. I just know they're real, and the official denial of their existence doesn't change that fact. The thermal recorder that documented everything is gone, disappeared into classified channels I'll never be able to access. But my field notes remain, detailed observations from a trained agent with over a decade of experience reading desert terrain and tracking movement patterns. I know what I saw. I know what it means, and I know that when I leave this job, I won't be going back to those borderlands. I've seen enough to understand that some territories belong to things that were there long before we drew our lines and set up our observation posts. 3 weeks from now, I'll turn in my badge and my equipment and return to a life where encounters like that night are someone else's problem. But I'll carry the memory of standing in that observation post, watching through thermal optics as something intelligent and predatory approached with tactical precision and deliberate intent. I'll remember the amber eyes reflecting back the spotlight's glare, the deliberate calculation in that moment of visual contact. And I'll remember the official response, the immediate classification, the removal of evidence, the instructions to forget what we saw and file sanitized reports. The border is not just a line between nations, it's a boundary between what we acknowledge and what we choose to ignore. On the night of November 2019, I saw something on the wrong side of that boundary, something that the official world is not ready to recognize. I'm telling this now because I'm beyond their reach, beyond the career consequences and the pressure to maintain silence. Someone needs to know what's out there in those remote stretches of high desert, watching our observation posts and moving through the darkness with purpose we can't fully understand. I spent 11 years protecting that border, and I never felt hunted until that night. The things I tracked through the thermal optics were not random wildlife. They were apex predators with intelligence and coordination that exceeded anything in our official understanding of desert fauna. They exist, whether science acknowledges them or not. And they're still out there, moving through the borderlands, using tactics that suggest they've been studying us as carefully as we try to study them.